Good evening again and welcome everyone. As you know, I'm Dan Winter, fractalu.com, fractalfield.com. And tonight's conversation is entitled Down Memory Lane with Bucky and Bentov and Vogel and Arthur Young and Rauscher and Puharich and many memories from our, and we're just chatting with Alan Rode here, who worked with Preston Nichols and the Montauk survivors and Guy Oblensky. You know, I bought my first polygraph from Guy Oblensky, and that's when they were measuring faster than light stuff. And that has to do with the perfect arc, which became the healing chamber, which is related to Therify, which is the Teslatron that Oblensky was working on at the time and Paul Harris is working on now. So anyway, let's see, do we have any announcements tonight, Tufan, or?
Sure, we can remind about next week's lecture, which will be Teresa Burns, the powerful hypercube symmetry of implosion, John Lee, Ophanim Enochian, way to angelics and ancestor communication. And we would also like to remind everyone to who are on YouTube, we would like everyone to hit subscribe and like and share this video on social media.
Yes, Tufan, I think your microphone is a little bit, we missed some of that, but just to say that Terry Burns is lecturing next week. She's with us, as you see, and she's on Alan Moore's channel there. There's Terry, she can wave.
Terry, 23.
Terry and Alan are extremely experienced in the techniques and science of, you might call it angel calls, advanced Ophanim Enochian magic, calling intelligent plasma beings. Aka John D. and Kelly worked with Vincent Bridges and the John D. story. And so Terry will be with us next week, and I think it's going to be a lot of and I have questions for you, Terry, too. It's going to be cool.
I can't wait.
Terry is also a very high-level academic. She has been in the English literature world all her life, and she's published many books, including those about D. and Kelly and worked with Vincent Bridges. So it's going to be a privilege. Thank you for doing this next week, Terry.
Hey, I really look forward to it. I can't wait. And just a quick teaser, if I could, what I want to look at some is in the way Dee and Kelly described what they do. What they did, if we just took their idea and brought in the concept of higher dimensions, we could pretty much explain it with the kind of language Dan uses. I mean, it's kind of uncanny. So anyway, more on that next week. And thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's very appropriate, Terry. Yes. So when Dee and Kelly talked about higher dimensions, you know, hypercube, that kind of thing, that points directly to what we described today when you get that cascade of harmonics, as in cubed dodeca, for example, which leads you to a compression wave, which is connective down to the longitudinal coherent EMF scalar. And this is where they were pointing when they talked about higher dimensional science, actually. And the connection is profound because indeed, as that compression, that squeeze, that implosion, for example, in DNA and bliss or in chanting, any kind of caduceus, as that implosion connects to the central still point, that is the longitudinal array in which larger circulations are possible, literally higher dimensions, which is precisely, we think, a longitudinal array. For example, where ancestor memories seem to communicate with kids when they first start seeing without their eyes, often they start also seeing their ancestors. Why is that so? It has to do with what we call inhabiting the array. And this is very deeply embedded, implicated in the metaphor of hypercube science and the higher dimensions that Dee and Kelly were deeply involved with. And John Dee was one of the leading, even mathematicians of his day. So this is very relevant. And of course, Vincent Bridges, who remembered in quite some detail his lifetimes, perhaps as Kelly and Flamel, he believed that I had certainly a piece of the memories of John Dee. We'll see.
You know, some of us don't doubt that, Dan. So it'll be great to talk. Thanks.
Yeah, well, you know, I prefer to call it a fragment of soul memory than reincarnation of, but either way, there are connections here, as in The Tempest.
Here we go.
The big storm. And speaking of which, when Alan and Terry helped us with the labyrinth ritual for rainmaking, we did have big storms here, but we haven't quite got the rain, although all our neighbors did in the towns nearby. So the dragons were coming. They just didn't quite get here yet.
Maybe we need to do another one.
Actually, we have one. So a week from today, actually, Terry, if you have time in the
yeah.
afternoon. Yeah, we found the place where the Druids in the valley used that magnetic vortex as a valve to control the magnetic lines down the valley fertility, the old Visigoth Druid magnetic vortex. And we plan to do a bit of a ritual there with the rainmaking crew. We call ourselves the Rainmakers.
Huh. Awesome.
We've special ordered more quartz material to piezoelectrically zap with the Therify. And yeah, all fun. Okay, so where do we begin? So tonight, I wanted to call it down memory lane, just in the sense that if we do look at, it's a very personal story to me, obviously, how I happened with incredible synchronicity to be continuously bumping into all of the VIPs of the science of consciousness of the second half of the last century. I seem to be bumping into and meeting and getting to know all of them incredibly, for better or for worse. And, more than just name dropping, this will be an inquiry into, have we unpacked the principles that all these very important people were seeking in their own studies, Bucky and Bentov and Arthur Young and Vogel and Rauscher and Puharich and Bearden and Preston Nichols and Alex and all these people that I worked with for many years. So those are the stories I want to tell. I'm going to start with actually a little bit of Bucky Fuller. Now, I was at University of Detroit, perhaps very fortunately so, and the Jesuits there were famous for quote unquote interdisciplinary everything. And one of the most interdisciplinary persons of that day was Buckminster Fuller, who regularly came by invitation and lectured to the architecture school at University of Detroit. And at that time, although I was in the electrical engineering, I was definitely, kind of a Renaissance kind of guy. And I found myself very shortly thereafter, literally carrying a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome with Buckminster Fuller halfway across the campus of University of Detroit. And when he came to the lecture hall, so what Bucky was expert at, clearly, was efficient use of material and efficient use of structure. So, for example, he was very good at teaching why cubic structures are inefficient, because squares get floppy very easily. Whereas if you have, for example, triangular-based icosahedral structures, that these are much more inherently stable and feature, because of that inherent stability, icosahedron, multi-frequency icosa, what he called the Bucky dome. It is true that you get more inherent stability per usage of material. And this was genius, and he was a genius, and there's some wonderful things there. But I want to point out that there's some things that got lost in the sauce there. So the next place I knew Bucky quite well after University of Detroit was when I was invited for the second international conference in Florence, Italy, sponsored by my good friend at that time, Gus Giacacci, through whom I had actually met Bucky the second time. Bucky stayed in the hotel with us for days. And, so we actually got to know each other fairly well. And one very important feature of that conversation had to do with what the vector flexor means. So I'm going to do a quick share screen here now. So I learned personally from Bucky how the non-destructive charge collapse works. But the thing is, he didn't call it charge collapse. At that time, he called it a vector flexor, or the jitterbug. And you can see why it's called a jitterbug. Between cube octa and icosa, both ways, it's literally a jitterbug. And it was only later that we learned that this was a model for charge collapse, not at the time of Bucky. Although recently now, Nassim has very usefully described that the trajectory followed by the outer vertex between the icosa and between the cube octa to the icosa, that trajectory of vortex nodes is actually a golden spiral and the trajectory of perfect conjugate charge collapse, literally charge implosion, which is a beautiful thing. But remember, Bucky had no involvement in understanding what any of these things meant electrically, which is what I want to talk about just briefly. So the other deeper part of this is that the way the 13th one is contained in the other 12, the 13th one is a separate sphere among 12 other in Cubacta, but the 13th sphere is merged with the other 12 when it becomes Icosa, which is more than metaphor for the Christ impulse for many deep and profound spiritual reasons, literally embedded in the 12 apostles. It's literally the beginning of an array. It's a beautiful metaphor for the Christed one and very useful. However, a point I want to make here. So later, when we set up our community in North Carolina, Bucky designed the geodesic dome. It was called the Biodome Community in Waynesville, North Carolina. We named it Circle of Life, and we had many adventures there starting a community there. You could write a book about that one. But so Bucky designed the geodesic dome there, and John Denver installed it. And guess what? This is a point I want to make. That metal sphere was one of the most geopathic structures I have ever been inside of. And we know personally multiple others who inhabit these geodesic spheres, and unfortunately, it is not healthy, actually. And Mother Nature will virtually never use a sphere for anything biologic other than an eyeball for one very simple reason, which is a sphere is harmonic exclusive, the opposite of harmonic inclusive. Harmonic inclusive identifies survival in every living thing. So obviously something that's the opposite of harmonic inclusive probably ain't the best thing to live inside of. And no, spheres are really not. And the reason is because the harmonic diameter of that sphere becomes so dominant that there is no implosion, no input, no invitation to implode. Whereas conversely, eggs are super healthy to live inside because the egg shape is profoundly plasma projective. For example, Michael Rice, one of our wonderful bioarchitects.net, many, if not most, of his beautiful biologic architecture structures are based on eggs, but never a sphere. Now, you think this is a minor principle, but what I'm saying to you is that at that time, architects had not and were not and did not think of architecture as the need to build a living capacitor. And that was a huge mistake. And I have to say, it is my humble opinion that the Bucky Fuller Institute today, I've tried to communicate with these guys, and they just do not want to hear it. No, they don't have a clue that living architecture means you got to build a living capacitor. And by the way, that ain't a metal sphere. Sorry. So, there's some beautiful things we can say about all the wonderful people I met in my life, but there's also in fact, most of the cases of these wonderful geniuses, there is one huge big blind spot, honestly. I don't mean to be egotistical or critical here. I'm simply pointing out in pure principle that the Fuller tradition did not understand that life force is a living capacitor. For example, then later when Buckminster Fullerene, which is basically carbon shaped like this, you shape carbon like this, you put it in a carbon arc, a perfect spark gap, and the carbon diamond will unpack that triangle just slightly and become this, icosahedondeca, and that's called Buckminster Fullerene, which is the hottest subject probably in all of chemistry, named after Bucky Fuller, and Bucky never had a clue of what that was or what it means. And what it means is the ability to conjugate and make life. That's why the center of Buckminster Fullerene is one of the most magic places to, for example, that's what microhydrogen for Pat Flanagan became. He learned to stick monatomic hydrogen in the center of a fullerene. So you got a conjugator and then you put an implosive hydrogen in the middle. It's magic, man. It's the ultimate free radical scavenger. So all I'm saying here is I was an electrical engineer at that time, listening to the architects talk about building the ideal building. But they didn't have a clue of what electric field makes life. And I'm suggesting to you that that's a bit of a mistake. And that's why we're here to like review our little lecture notes. Anywho, actually at that time, I mentioned that Gus Ciccacci had introduced me to, Gus is the architect who sponsored a lot of our gatherings in those days. His house was built on the shape of one ladder rung of DNA, hex, pentacle, and rectangle. Amazing story with. So warm regards to Gus Ciccacci. And then actually Pierre Vilayat Khan from the Abode was at the conference in Florence, Italy at that time. And, that's where I got to work with some of the people at the Abode of the Message, et cetera, et cetera. And you know who else showed up there? Ben Bentov, the number 2 person on our list here. So let me tell you my little Ben Bentov story. Let's see, slide number 109 here. We're going to do that just one more time. Keynote, longitudinal, Star Trek Future, slide number 109. You've seen that slide before, but how I came to meet Bucky, I was living with the Gurdjieff community. First, I had been at the Gurdjieff School, Claymont.org in Charlestown, West Virginia, but then there's Bucky. I'm sorry, there's Bentov. Okay, so you've all seen this slide. You know that I worked with Bentov for years. And I was literally, he had kind of adopted me. I worked in his laboratory with this capacitive accelerometer, his polygraph at that time, because that's what I was at the University of Detroit, electrical engineer. I was a polygraph builder. So when I learned that he was using a capacitor to measure when the spine liquid pump harmonics caused the brain liquids around the ventricle to get horny, to form a cone from the coherent phone out of the sacrocranial. And Bentov had measured all that. Obviously, I was very, very grateful for my friendship with Ben, and he was wonderful to me. For example, then later, when I was coming and going from the first and second International Physics of Consciousness Symposium with Bill Tiller and all the boys, and there was one in Toronto and one at Harvard, and I was traveling with Elizabeth Rauscher at the time, and she's another person on our list. And guess who invited us to stay with him? Ben Bentov. We did have adventures. Anywho, when Bentov came to Florence and joined us, he was on his way to be the Maharishi's laboratory genius in Switzerland on that trip. And my criticism of Maharishi even then and later was they portended to measure brain coherence, and in fact, never actually learned how to quantify internal phase coherence with the septum in the brain or the heart, and they had never measured heart coherence. And so I got into it with Ben a little bit in those days, and Ben was a perfect gentleman and an incredibly articulate ambassador for the science of consciousness. I don't think there has been one better. And I had wonderful relationships then with Murtala after Ben died, his wife. And you know how he died in the great Chicago plane crash 191. And there were talks about, well, the angels told him, but why didn't he get off that plane? And it was quite a story about, there were conspiracy theories. But the point was actually that Ben, the story was later that he was ready to play with the angels. But the other part of the Bentov story, which is going to lead us to Puharich, is that Ben Bentov and Puharich were in effect on opposite sides of the Arab-Israeli war, effectively at that time. And so when Puharich began, he was hosting Uri Geller at that time. And I had known Uri Geller because I had stayed with Judy Scutch in New York City as she was publishing Course in Miracles with Helen Schuckman, who I also knew very well, who wrote it, who didn't want to take credit for writing Course in Miracles, actually. And I had this conversation with Helen Schuckman at the time. I said, what the medium is the message, who said medium is the message? A famous Marshall McLuhan, yeah. And so, but it was just like Ken Carey after he wrote Return to the Bird Tribes. he didn't want to take credit for writing what was apparently a spiritually channeled. And yet, if the medium is the message, maybe there's something deeper here. Later, we realized that the Course in Miracles in some way was an astral document, in the sense that, and they were all Jewish professors. And the reason Helen Schuckman didn't want to admit that she wrote Course in Miracles was because she was a professor of statistics at NYU, and this was not quite coherent with her career path, or so she thought. Point being that if you look at the subtext of Course in Miracles, it was, there is no order of difficulty in miracles, and therefore you should not try to understand. Do you see there's a problem with this message here? And do you think this has something to do with Enlil, who's perhaps behind the Jewish tradition here? I'm not being critical of the Jewish tradition, but I'm just saying there's something not quite fully empowering about someone who tells you you're not supposed to understand, which is the implicate, not explicative message behind Course in Miracles. And I know I will get some criticism for this, but this is my humble opinion, actually. Anywho, I used to sleep at Judy Scutch's in New York City all during that time. And Uri Geller was there, and Helen Schuckman was there. And Uri Geller was later adopted by Andrea Puharich. And so now Uri Geller is staying with Andrea Puharich. And, they got miracles happening everywhere, and airline tickets are falling from the ceiling. And Bentov is saying, oh, hello, Andrea Puharich does not have astral hygiene. That was Bentov's message, actually, in the sense that was not able to discriminate, what plasma entities were showing up in his living room. And actually, in my humble opinion, that also in some ways applies to John Dee. It's not, I'm not, and Teresa will address this, I'm sure, next week. But, Michael Sarian's criticism of John Dee, which Teresa probably rightfully disagrees with, was that, there were some of these entities that should not have been called. And Teresa has very valid arguments around this. But the point is, it is not for me to stand in judgment about who called good ghosts and who called bad ghosts. I'm not that clever. No, all I'm saying is you do absolutely need to be aware of what is your mechanism for discrimination about which astral entities you call, because all ghosts ain't smart. And this was essentially what Bentov was saying about Puharich. Now, even later, when Puharich died on the Reynolds Foundation porch, the story, the myth at the time, remember that Vincent Bridges knew Andrea Puharich very well, and I knew him because we used to bump into each other all the time at the psychotronics conferences, and his lady played the piano, and we had great conversations. But when Michael Sala recently interviewed me about Andrea Puharich, obviously it was because Andrea is the guy that first talked to Enki, Ea. At the time, Andrea said, well, the guy on the phone here says that he's Atun. I remember this later became the Star Trek series. This is actually Star Trek physics, because this is how Phyllis Schlemmer came to meet the Nine, was when Andrea Puharich introduced them. Now, there's a point I want to make about this, about Andrea Puharich tonight, having to do with science, real empowering science. Star Trek Future keynote, one moment, and I have a slide prepared for this. One moment, Puharich, let's see here. Preston Nichols is 181. Puharich is slide number 87 to 89. Just bear with me one second. So the point I want to make about Andrea Puharich beginning to channel the Nine, first they said, oh, this is Tom calling. And then it says, well, really, I'm Atun, as in Akhenaten. Who is Atun? Oh, and then they later, oh, really, that's Enki. Oh, that's Ea. Hello, that is the leader behind what became the Hermes Thos legend. Well, how did it happen that Andrea Puharich started making phone calls with the Nine? This is the $100,000 question. And I wanted to make a point about this. I'm displaying the slide here from Storm Bear Williams' website, one of the good friends who was with us for the Ophanim Enochian angel calls at Red Rocks, where we called really big storms, actually, whom Teresa knows very well. And Storm Bear and Vincent Bridges knew Andrea very well, to the point they were really trying to implement some of his hydrogen implosion technologies for implosion engines, which were based on a frequency signature, by the way. Anywho, so in the obituary here, Storm Bear is talking about Josh Reynolds, whom I also knew quite well, who had invited Andre to stay at the estate, the Reynolds tobacco estate, which is where Andre Puharich died. Now, there are many pieces of this story, and I think maybe Teresa might do some of this next week. But the piece of the story that I wish to mention here is what Andre was doing at that time and just before the time. It's actually Henry K. Puharich, as you see on the side. He was developing technologies for bypassing the ear so that deaf people could hear. Now, what does that have to do with channeling Enki, Hermes, and the Nine? I suggest everything. What actually, my having studied this now, mostly in retrospect, that what Andre had discovered was actually a piezoelectric way of triggering clairaudience, which I'm sure Andre would not have described it that way, but I believe I'm something of an expert now on the physics of clairaudience. Remember, after my intense Kundalini, and I had extreme theta and delta and alpha coherence, extreme low frequency coherence, but very little gamma. And if you happen to know the brainwave physics of this, this kind of points to the evolution of clairaudience and not clairvoyance. And I had precious little clairvoyance, but even today I can often talk to ancestors on my good days. And I, for example, when I was living on the Cherokee Sacred Burial Ground in North Carolina, where we founded Circle of Life, it was literally the start of the Trail of Tears right there. And I could hear the wailing of the Cherokee ancestors in my ear. I mean, it was real. I knew this was ancestor voices, quite literally. And now I understand why, because the magnetic rivers are ancestor memory, and that's why Aboriginals call them God. Well, what was the physics of the onset of clairaudience for me? Hello. Exactly what Andre Puharich was doing. He was using a piezoelectric RF modulated heterodyne, and he would piezoelectrically couple to the parts of the bone which were also piezo. And then when you get the potential for an infinite harmonic cascade of heterodynes, actually, and I don't think Andrea could have articulated this at the time, although I think he probably knew Bearden, but he was actually coupling or impedance matching to a longitudinal array, actually. So when it's similar to, the kids who are learning to see without their eyes, they say, oh, a vortex appeared inside my head and now I can see without my eyes. And then a little while later, they learn they can see their ancestors and their relatives freak out. You ain't supposed to see your ancestors. Well, that's called impedance matching to a longitudinal array. And my clairaudience began that way. So what does this say about Andre Puharich making the first phone call to, there you have Enki Ea, who was, the engineer behind Hermes Thoth, who was the pyramid builder and probably was the same guy as Quetzalcoatl Viracocha, and Enki. Ea probably is the same guy called Osiris, sun god. And they're trying to re-engineer the planet after the parasites caused trouble. I mean, Enlil Yahweh, the Atum versus the Atun versus the Amun. So the Amun Egyptian was Enlil Yahweh, and the Atun, as in the name of the guy that introduced himself to Andre Puharich, Atun. I'm Atun making a phone call. Oh, and that lineage was also called Thutmosis. So you get the whole idea. This was a lineage of life force scientists. Whether you call it Hermetic or Thoth, doesn't matter. The principle is how that caduceus cascades couples to the implosive center point of the longitudinal array, introducing systematic DNA radio. And who was the guy on the planet at that time most able to make those phone calls with some knowledge of science? That person was Andre Puharich. So why did Enki Ea use that guy to make some of the first phone calls? Well, hello, it's obvious. So later, There was a problem with Andrei Puharich, obviously, and that is that he was following these communications in a way that was not always empowering and was not always discriminating. And so he went to Mexico and he got in serious trouble with some of the shamans there. I mean, you know, entity possessions, and he had no, and Andrea also had serious astral hygiene problems. For example, you know, diet and many things, many addictions. That's one of the other things in common. As we go down this list now, we're going to be talking about Tom Bearden. We're going to be talking about Elizabeth Rauscher. We're going to talk about Marcel Vogel. And I have to say, I want to say this in the most gentle and loving way I can, but I need to say it. All of these people had horrible astral hygiene. Their diet was terrible. Their posture was terrible. Their glands were a mess. How could they have astral hygiene? They did not. And this is a lesson to all of us. It's great to be a genius scientist, but if you don't know how to have astral hygiene and discipline around your diet, sorry, it just don't work. And that was true of Vogel and Bearden. And, you know, these people, when you're that overweight and that your diet has no discipline and is subject to ego problems and astral discrimination problems. So there was a serious, continuous sequence of problems. And actually, I have to say, you know, Chris Bird, same story. And I knew them all very well, and I cared about them. And I'm so grateful for what I learned from them. And I'm not being, you know, critical or egotistical here, but I'm saying to you that one thing that all these people had in common was very little concept of what astral hygiene even is. But, well, and speaking of Chris Bird, so, you know, Chris Bird really was the first one at that time to be actively studying Antoine Priory, what eventually became Therapy.net. And in fact, invited me to help him translate the French books. And my knowledge of French at that time was even worse than it is now. And it ain't good now either. So I didn't do a good job of translating Antoine Priory's book in French. But I knew deep down that Antoine Priory, who became famous in France for healing thousands of cancers, was onto something. So 30 years later, when I found out that the frequency series that Antoine Priory approximated fit a new equation that I just wrote, that's the day we started building Therapy.net. And I have in part Chris Bird to thank for. And Chris Bird was best buddies with Cleve Baxter, who wrote The Secret Life of Plants. And when I got to Toronto, and for I think it was the first International Physics Conscious Symposium, and Marcel Vogel was staying in the same room with Jean Ringe, Human Dimensions Institute, and myself. And Marcel Vogel, he could hold that crystal and he could see, he literally saw the birth of a symbol for Christos inside a piezoelectric crystal. He could see that. He was clearly had some very good shamanic skills on the plus side. On the negative side, at that time, I was working with Louis Acker, who had too much LSD, wrote the book Handbook of Astrology with Francis Sequoian from Maine, whom I also knew. But the point was that Louis Acker was the ultimate Atlantean fire crystal guy, because after enough LSD, of course, he might remember too many of his Atlantean incarnations, and he did. and again, I learned a lot from Louis Acker. In fact, when Louis Acker built this, he did it with welding rod. he was not messing around. But anyway, we had a conference because I knew at that time Virgil Bottom, who wrote Theory and Design, of course, crystal oscillators, and we had a conference on the Atlantean fire crystal, toy stone, as Edgar Casey called that fire crystal, which later today we realize is the precedent for the Koski-Frost crystal, which you've seen my slideshow. That is a prime example of a warp drive. Okay, so you know the ability to have and be a warp drive is literally. Well, no, we might have to get the slide out for that. But the point is that I want to talk about what Marcel Vogel got right and what Marcel Vogel did not get right in terms of the quartz crystal technology. So remember, I was working on the fire crystal story from Steiner and Edgar Casey. Yes, oh, here, finally. Sorry, it took so long. Okay, so we talked about this in the other show, but look, here is the, I believe this is the Excelsior. This is the Galactic Federation, one of the crafts of the good guys. But if you look at the crystal up the core, that is obviously probably hex or octa crystal. If you know what a fire crystal was from Atlantis, or if you know what a super dielectric trigger dumping a phase conjugate pump wave into the super dielectric crystal, the cause of the warp drive, you're going to pump those dilithium crystals, Scotty. Well, dilithium is actually lithium niobate, and it's a super dielectric. And guess what this structure on top is? That is a carbon nano-related super dielectric dumping a phase conjugate pump wave, literally a caduceus, broad spectral RF cascade, implosive, right into that crystal. And that's called a warp drive, guys. And it ain't a mystery. It's called physics. So, you know, you can imagine I had a bit of an interview with Marcel Vogel about this. Okay, I'm going to stop the share now. And I'm very grateful that Dan Willis has done all these shows with Elena Denon, and Elena's a great friend, and I'm looking forward to more conversations with her. We're planning some fun stuff, including the lecture in Tours near Paris in July. And, you know, so they've done some good work on this. However, that being said, on a technical side, I think I knew Marcel Vogel better than Dan Willis, at least in one sense. So, of course, I was an IBM systems analyst at that time as well. And so I had this talk with Marcel. I said, oh, well, your Vogel crystals are beautiful, but are you lining up the facet planes with the molecular planes? Because otherwise the phase conjugate pump wave doesn't work. And you see, at that same Toronto Physics of Consciousness Symposium, there is Marcel Vogel. He is sweating up a storm. He's holding one of his famous quartz crystals, and he's pumping, and he's waiting for the polygraph connected to the plant to prove that he has communicated with that plant. Very useful science, and we both knew Clive Baxter, who actually kind of wrote the book on that, Secret Life of Plants, which is now one of the primary activities they do at Damen-Hur in Italy. Actually, they connect polygraphs to plants. Well, I was in on the early days of that because I was building, it's called GSR, galvanic skin resistance transducers, and the same skin resistance transducer you put on the fingers of a college male to find out when he saw Playboy magazine to see if the GSR goes off the charts. Well, you don't have to change anything. You put those on a plant leaf, and guess what? You're talking to that plant, and that plant will know immediately if you're thinking about hurting it, for sure. Well, Marcel Vogel was very good at proving he could talk to plants, which is wonderful. However, the physics of how that works is called a phase conjugate pump wave, which in Marcel Vogel's case is actually the low frequencies of his brain and his heart and his spine liquid pump. That's a phase conjugate pump wave, and that's how you pump out a longitudinal from a Vogel crystal. But Marcel, unfortunately, didn't know what a phase conjugate pump wave is, I don't believe, although Bearden did. And Marcel, unfortunately, didn't know how to accurately line up the facet planes. So he could have actually never built an Atlantean fire crystal, but I think we can. In the book on Koski-Frost in fractalfield.com/propulsion by Elizabeth Bill Donovan is a useful example of a warp drive, actually. So all I'm saying is that each of these wonderful scientists that I was privileged to know in those days, there were big, huge pieces of the puzzle which were absolutely missing from their worldview. And this is a bit of a limitation. So all these groups that are, you know, kind of worshiping these people, like I've talked about Tesla before, I'm not saying I'm better than any of these people. That's not my message. Tesla was a genius, absolutely. However, Tesla did not have the frequencies right, nor did he have the nodal locations right to do global wireless power, because he didn't understand the details about coherent longitudinal interferometry. Although he did have beam weapons that were based precisely on longitudinals, but he didn't understand, for example, that longitudinal EMF is a gravity wave. Hello. So he didn't understand why his high voltage systems sometimes cause earthquakes. Whereas Tom Bearden did know. He wrote the equations to prove how the longitudinal compressional component of the EMF is what a gravity wave is made of. Bearden was a real hero here. And how did I know Bearden? Again, that was through psychotronics, and we had many friends in common. But Bearden, again, there were two issues with Bearden. One is he was, how should you say, it seemed like he was afraid of the Russians. His book Excalibur Briefing about these scalar waves, which we now know are longitudinal. So the clouds you could see for 100 miles down the sky river, the clouds have all become columnated. And that was what he called the Russian woodpecker. And I'm sure he was right about that, because the Russians got all the longitudinal RF scientists from Germany, even though the Americans got the rocket scientists, but that was not the most important thing, actually. So why was Bearden afraid of the Russians? Because he realized, he realized that longitudinal interferometry was more powerful than rockets. It's simple and it's true, and it remains true today. Anywho, Bearden was a pioneer, but now here's some limitation. Of course, Bearden had terrible hygiene. Living down south, if it ain't fried, you don't eat it. And that ain't healthy. Am I right about that, Alan?
Yes.
And I don't want to criticize Southern living here. But anywho, but the other major issue with Bearden was how could you say this? He couldn't burp without getting a permit from the government first. And that's a problem. Because remember, he was a former NASA engineer. So there were a lot of people he couldn't talk to. He couldn't share it with. But he managed with a desperate sincerity to share as much as he could before he died. And he clearly, he certainly could have lived longer if he had some hygiene. That's obvious. But in terms of noble intent to empower the younger generation, Bearden he tried really hard and did very well. And while I'm at it now, right on our list, so Bearden, we want to compare with Hal Puthoff and Charlie Tart. Now, both Puthoff and Tart were at those early gatherings, the Physics of Consciousness Symposium, and Charlie Tart was something of the hero. He was the hippie with the backpack, and he was writing psychology and physics and consciousness. So I like Charlie Tart a lot. Whereas Hal Puthoff, unfortunately, got in this same situation where you couldn't burp without getting a permit from the military, basically, and that ain't fun. And now today we know that actually Puthoff has adopted some of our friends confidentially and is doing his best to empower the younger generation in spite of. So we have to honor Hal Puthoff for that. Anyway, but we're not going to mention names in that regard. But so, again, I had the privilege of getting to know many of these people. So how am I doing on my list? Or do we want to do a few questions first?
Sure. We have a couple of questions. First one from Patrick. What is Bob Drach working on now, and what exactly did his Godbox software do?
I forgot to put Bob Drach on my list. Oh my God. So thank you very much. No, Bob Drach was in the living room with us at Greg Hoag's of Metaform, scanning Wendy Thacker's spine for the history of bliss and measuring the adenosine diphosphate 1.91 angstrom wavelength emission, the microwave emission from the spine liquid, which is the ultimate hospital scanner and would replace all hospital scanners if the military hadn't stole it, as Bob Drach is fond of saying. And they didn't know at the time that 1.91 angstroms was exactly phase conjugate to Planck. In other words, that's why the microwave of the spine is the best way to measure Kundalini. And then you turn that microwave scanning horn antenna. The best way to study ceremonial magic is microwave emissions. And it was the ultimate dowsing tool. So the Earth grid is profoundly symbiotic, profoundly to precisely cellular microwave ADP 1.91 angstroms. It's so cool. Anywho, so after you understand that, you can, of course, use microwave cascades to trigger temporary kinds of bliss experiences, and Bob Drach did that, and that was the God Box. And at that time, Jirka Rysavy was supporting Bob Drach and myself, and Drunvalo, and a few others, Stan Tenen. So Jirka was the checkbook in town. I guess I have to tell this story since you brought it up. So after we founded the community in North Carolina, Drunvalo called me up, and they sponsored some of my first world tours, and said, you got to come over here. Jirka's starting the biggest party in town, which happened to be Corporate Express turning into Gaia TV at that time. And so sure enough, Jirka flew out to our community in North Carolina to meet me. And I ended up helping him design the studio that became Gaia TV today, actually, and met Jay Widener there. We just did a lecture together. And so we regarded ourselves as the philosophic founders of Gaia TV because we were the esoteric experts on staff consulting, supposedly. And there was lots of adventures. And that's how Jay Widener came to meet Vincent Bridges through me, and they co-authored together then the Monument to the End of Time, et cetera. And the rest is history. But now to try to answer your question, Bob Dratch evolved that system into what became related to ground penetrating radar and involved in profound, highly sophisticated resource location for underground technologies. And you should talk to Bob directly if you like, but he certainly has incredibly powerful systems for locating selectively, not just water and oil, but selectively incredible resource locating skills by identifying complex waveform frequency signature prints of underground resources. So that's one of the things Bob is working on today. And I'm sure there are many others, but anyway, enough for that. Yes, next question.
Next one comes from Dan Mack. Are the Filipino people associated with the bird tribe?
Filipino. Yeah, so I don't suppose I know. I think the term Filipino actually does refer to a bird tribe. We're recalling here when Ken Carey sent the first manuscript for Return of the Bird Tribe to me, and didn't want his name on it at the time either. And we realized that what he was calling bird tribe, later we knew is what the Cherokee, whom we were living with at the time, and Dahaniwa, who identified this connection, what the Cherokee called the Adawi, which is literally the return of the bird tribe, which we then learned were what the Cherokee and Iroquois had called also bird tribe, and was directly related to the ancestral lineage of their hero, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, quote-unquote god, Viracocha Quetzalcoatl, who we now know is Hermes, Thoth, whom we believe actually is the 9-foot-tall giant. One of his bodies is in a stasis chamber, we believe, under Florida, as JP and Michael Sala, I think, are accurately reporting. But how important and global that return of the bird tribes is, it literally is the return of Enki Ea, and is the return of the science of caduceus, hermetically sealed, of life force. Remember, Thoth is Thothmosis, the name of the whole royal lineage of Egypt. Thoth is for whom Thule, the South Pole and the North Pole are named, the Abzu of Enki, and Thoth is the name of the royal lineage, the line of Tehuti, actually becomes DWD, the line of David of the Hebrews, and Thoth is literally the father of the bloodline of what's later called Magdalene and Jesus. The royal line of Egypt becomes the Essenes directly. So this Thoth critter, man, he gets around. What's he up to? Well, obviously, it ain't about personality worship. No, it's about who is going to teach the science of what is life force and how is it generated. And later now what Enki calls Ea, calls the return of the Adam Kadmon, which is it isn't just a genetic recipe. It's actually a kind of restoration of the sequencing of DNA that allows it to implode and make a soul. And that is Humpty Dumpty's egg. Remember, when the DNA braids recursively and implodes in the presence of the phonon infrasound of bliss, and we measured that thanks to Glenn Ryan, what happens is that compression wave spits out the coherent longitudinal, which we now know and can measure is the physics of what you can lucid dream with and remote view with and survive death with. So that coherent longitudinal interferometry, that emission of the stuff called the Ba from the Khan Egypt, and the Kesjan body from Gurdjieff, and the rainbow light body, everybody has a name. So that ability to make a soul depends on whether that DNA sequencing has the right spacers for alignment of the active sites. Remember, who's programming the DNA? Whoever's doing the braiding, because that determines what's inside and outside the fold, and thus gets access to the RNA to replicate. So the braider is the operator. Who's the braider? The phonon cascade of human love and bliss, coherent emotion, literally. So when our genetics people say, oh, that's junk DNA because we can't observe anything coding there, it reveals only their ignorance, because the mechanical alignment of the spacing of the active sites depends upon a structurally coherent DNA that is able to implode coherently. So everything has to line up exactly when it braids, implodes, and tightens, and the plot thickens. And that, speaking of Montauk, is what was called boson 7 at Montauk, which was a predictor of who could steer the time chair at time travel and effectively lucid dream. Remember, they only abducted lucid dreamers. The Greys only took lucid dreamers, and the Dracos who operated at Montauk, they only took lucid dreamers. Why? Because they had that coherence and it was measurable. And that is what was called microchloridians in the blood, metaphorically, in the Star Wars series, we believe, which is literally related to the biophoton emission of what they call living plasma in subcellular microscopy. Galileo, the microscope, talked about that. So that ability of the living cell to emit living plasma, microzymes, is directly related to having a soul, because that's the beginning of the coherent light body. And all of that is precisely what was understood indirectly by those studying that physics of soul. And that was the Yankee message. Okay, I carried on in that one, but that is a return of the bird tribes. Last question.
Regarding bird tribe, Shetty is asking if you know anything relating to the mummy.
I think Vincent Bridges was my teacher mostly on the physics of mummification. But, I had gotten, I've talked about this before, I had gotten very fascinated when Vincent told me, well, they served mummy powder in every pharmacy in Europe for 300 years. Why? Because it was rich in gold powder. Well, then I had to ask the next question, what was that gold powder doing in all the mummy powder? And I said, oh, these Egyptians were eating a lot of gold powder. And he said, no. Well, he didn't say that, but he implied. No, what happened was, the natron salt chosen for mummification had to be of the exquisite dielectric to be implosive enough to alchemically transmute the living flesh to an Ormuz amulet. In other words, there was some clue in the physics of mummification to how to make a coherent longitudinal light body, because super dielectric around the mummy as it's heating and imploding, what's that going to do? Do you know what the green man, red man legend in the Tibetan tradition is? When the body shrinks and the only thing left is fingernails and hair? What do you think enables perfect shrinking? Could that be non-destructive compression? What enables that? A perfect dielectric. Who was studying the physics of mummification? Where did that come from? Hint, I think there's a clue. The guy who designed the pyramid, otherwise known as Hermes, he knew the frequency signature. So yeah, the physics of mummification is actually about creating an altar, an alchemic altar upon which an anchor point to a longitudinal array by successful electrical compression can be enabled, for the same reason that a great saint in Tibet will be covered with a thin film of gold.
Thank you. Shelley comments, probably relates, but not mummification, rather an entity called the mummy. Sounds like ma-me.
Yeah, there's a lot of mother in there, and
And then Max says that is the niter in alchemy, natron or niter.
That's right. The natron. The natron is a form of salt, but it's a very particular kind of salt. I would hypothesize requires a relatively high dielectric content, a high dielectric constant, in order to enable implosive capacitance. Exactly. Yes.
Okay. Next question from Tomislav. Forgive the newbie question, but what's the most obvious benefit in life to good astral hygiene?
Astral hygiene is, in a way, a name for, do you know how to swim in living plasma? So examples of bad astral hygiene would mean in most any bar where lots of alcohol is being consumed, there will be plasma parasites all over the place. And that's called bad astral hygiene. And if you swim in there for very long, you're going to come out with all kinds of entities stuck to your body, making messes and causing you to have weird thoughts all over the place. So that's bad astral hygiene, obviously. So one benefit of knowing about astral hygiene is knowing how to, avoid and how do you clean yourself after something like that? Remember that supersaturation with oxygen, for example, is an excellent way to rid astral parasites. So, for example, if you were to deep breathe and then get underwater, preferably in living water, and do that a couple of times, most of the astral parasites would, be cleansed. Another example is you imagine a very fine tooth comb passing through your aura that's blue. And as you pass this comb through your aura, any astral entities will show up as little black or red blobs. And you'll realize that you can comb your aura just like you comb your hair if you're good at visualizing. There's lots of techniques for astral hygiene. Another example of good astral hygiene is when a tribal shaman gathers all the members of the family together and they do a trance dance. Well, when they go into trance, yes, entities inhabit their body. But why is it the right entities? It's because every single tribal elder in that trance bliss circle has a clear, definite intent that only our ancestors will be invited in to live inside inhabit our auras, actually. So that very focused, clear intent means that, non-members of the family ain't invited and they're not coming in. So that very focused, pure and shareable intent with the intent to serve will create an astral membrane. That's an example of astral hygiene. There are many, many, but basically, astral body we now know is simply a name for the coherence of your aura and the plasma that represents, which is simply a cloud of charge. And handling that coherence is life or death. Another example of astral hygiene, every time you stand under the wrong kind of electric light, you immediately realize that your aura is being toasted and eaten. Like sometimes at these health food stores, then they have mercury vapor lights that'll just screw with your aura, man. Get the hell out of underneath mercury vapor lights. Well, this is another example of astral hygiene that you recognize immediately when anybody's messing with your aura, just like Jesus said, oh, somebody touched my garment, my capacitance just bled slightly. And when you think of these things like an electrical engineer, you can do this with some rigor and without being bogged down with all this personality worship and miracle worship. It's pure scientific, pure principle that does make the whole process beautiful and loving, but it doesn't require miracle worship or personality worship. Anywho.
Denmark asks, would an imploder shower do the same thing as dunking living water?
The imploder shower could help. Particularly, remember, the imploder shower is just a perfected vortex. And if the water happens to be piezo or hard water, then that vortex will have a significant voltage bias. And then what comes out the other side of that vortex will have a spinning implosive charge density, and it can be very helpful. Obviously, if you add the magnetic array, it's even more so, super imploder or ultra imploder. But the vortex, the triploder, or the imploder shower, they're all at theimploder.com. And thank you for giving me the opportunity for a little ad here. But any kind of implosive vortex, yes, of course, because the principle is the implosion point is where the pure sorting phenomena happens. Because at the implosive compression point, any wave that cannot fit that phase discipline is canceled. That's the fundamental principle that anytime the more intense the vortex of plasma you invite into yourself, the more intense it gets. For example, inhabiting lightning, if you happen to be Daniel Brinkley or having Kundalini, if you inhabit a lightning bolt, yes, you will get sorted if you don't get dead. You will get sorted because at the implosion point, only the shareable wave survives. That means if you have access to enough bliss, as we always say, you will have no problem with stomach parasites or astral parasites. Access to bliss is a determining factor, because at the implosion point, you not only does only the shareable wave survive, and that's Shelley's website, by the way, but also the radio, the DNA radio to the collective unconscious is enabled. So the more you can inhabit a still point and relax and see, like I did in that French church recently, I could look down the magnetic line that crossed that church, and I could see the watery grotto cave just down the road by looking down the magnetic line crossing that church. You could use it as a periscope, quite literally. Okay. Are we continuing my list, or are we doing questions?
Yes. Last
Would you like to continue, or how shall we do it?
One or two more. The questions are so much fun anyway.
All right, all right. So there's an eclipse on Thursday. Should we do something to prepare? Are there deeper implications of this?
You know, it's my view that the reason a seed will not germinate when the moon blocks the sun toward that seed, the reason the seed will not grow is because the hollow metal artificial moon is the opposite of high dielectric, and therefore massively interferes with the longitudinal interferometry from the sun, which is the physics of all growth. Remember, you take a copper plate on your roof and a copper wire to the basement, another copper plate, you need no light and your plants will grow just fine because the longitudinal wave from the sun makes it to the basement. Well, if that longitudinal wave don't make it there and the sun is a blocker for that, then that prevents a seed from germinating. So anybody who's ever read a biodynamic calendar knows that if you would like a seed to grow, you have to avoid the moon. This means the moon ain't really the good guy. Now, here's a little context here. After the Lesser Dryad flood, when the Galactic Federation tried to blow the hell out of the Nebu here and only partially succeeded, and they blew up half the solar system, Mars lost its atmosphere, and Tiamat caused the great flood, and you know, everything that Graham Hancock missed when he ignored the ET part of his own story. Anywho, so the physics of the moon is that it was necessary to stabilize the planet on its new orbit, and the moon has only been around Earth relatively recently, but it's an old Andromedan hollow metal planetoid, and it ain't a good dielectric. So that means that underneath a full moon, it is medically documented that hospitals fill up and more people have accidents. This is not arbitrary. This is very simple physics, because access to the longitudinal array is inhibited. So it is my view that during a full moon is a good time to duck. You know, I'm not arguing with all the witches who said, well, let's go out and howl at the moon. What I am saying is that the access to the solar mind is at a minimum when the moon is between you and the sun. And this is not a good time to drink from the longitudinal blood circulation system of the solar system.
Then I would like to squeeze a question in from myself. The intuitive skills are quite important to maintain a good hygiene. And would you recommend any practical exercises to have a good intuitive skill?
Well, a good intuitive skill is probably one of the most important things in all of life. We certainly agree on that. And actually, you know, even listening to someone who talks fast like me is relatively unimportant compared to having good intuition, actually. In fact, about the only thing I would really recommend me for is for developing your own intuition. And after you do that, you should not need me, for sure. Intuition is everything. And intuition is directly, and by the way, even Bucky called it christening the good ship intuition. He was right about that. Intuition is a name for your access to the bloodstream of the collective longitudinal array, for sure. And the things that enable you to connect with the longitudinal array is everything about intuition, from sitting still in the Agnihotra to meditation, to the brainwave collapse, to the implosive diet, to sacred architecture. All the things that we describe as the hygiene for bliss are directly mean access to intuition. And when you start doing any of these things right about getting regular access to bliss experience, you shouldn't need me anymore at all, for one thing. you know, because your intuition is going to do the whole job. So it is all about harnessing intuition, absolutely. And that's the beginning of what, you know, the extraterrestrial cultures use. They don't bother talking. They use telepathy. Well, what is that? Advanced intuition, obviously. So advanced brainwave coherence is beginning. And remember, when we first measured the first octave cascade in brainwaves, and we called that telepathy, and then we measured a golden ratio cascade, and we called it bliss, and then we realized you need both in order to do the real fun stuff, like how Jean-Charles Moyen bilocated. So we were really talking about forms of intuition. Absolutely the most important thing there is, and it's identical with the science of bliss, for sure. And what form your inner voice takes, in mine, it took clairaudience. I would hear voices of ancestors. I would hear ringing. I would hear a song. I would interpret. So my inner voice began with the ringing in the ear, you know, and some people know which ancestor is calling by which ear is ringing. And we measure the frequencies of the ringing in the ears of bliss meditators. And we know the physics now. It's the ventricle horns, phonon coherence. And that is called Sangreal, song in the blood, because it is a song in the blood.
Thank you. We have 6 more questions. If you have more slides, maybe we can leave those to the end.
Well, let's see. Did I cover the most important point? So what I mentioned is that when I knew the boys from Montauk, we talked about Guy Obolensky, about the first polygraph, and Alan Rode is here, who has been a lifetime studying some of the Guy Obolensky work. And then at that time, Ken Page, Multidimensional Cellular Healing, visited me at my farm, and along with Marcia Andriola, and they were the psychologists helping the Montauk boys to recover, actually, and they were using muscle twitching to talk with the inhabiting ghosts of trauma recovery. And at that time, I got to know a bit Michael Ash, who that's a pen name, but it was the chief time, actually we call it the navigator of the time chair at Montauk. It was called a time empath, actually. And it's very instructive to understand what was meant by a time empath, that, you know how we now know that the advanced starcraft, for example, from Aldebaran, as the raid on Montauk revealed, that the advanced starcraft are literally navigated by the living plasma of the star navigator. More than metaphor for the guild navigators of Dune from Dune, who were immersed in a vat of what is in fact gold water, which we now know is the super dielectric, enabling their aura to be massively broad spectral implosive, enabling them to be a guild navigator. When you go faster than light, you know, a switch ain't fast enough. No, it has to be a mind. And who is that navigator? Well, that's the central subject of most of our luciddreamteam.com conversations is, how do you get to be the navigator? In other words, first, oh, I'm lucid dreaming. How am I going to steer? Or Jean-Charles Moyen is bilocating. And then he says, how am I going to steer? And then the beehive is swarming. And then they say, how am I going to steer? Well, you know, the beehive only swarms if there's royal blood present. Royal blood is a name for implosive genetic, actually, which can steer superluminally. Or faster than light steerage is identical with what longitudinal EMF coherence is. So the first part about longitudinal coherence is that the array is bouncing at the fractal nodes, the dodecacosa, and then around that array, increasing numbers of golden ratio harmonics times c, the speed of light, circulates, called the next dimension. And that's why ultimately the portals and stargates seem to be instantaneous. They're not exactly instantaneous. They're quasi-instantaneous based on how many harmonics of golden ratio times c, the speed of light, they propagate. And the more density there is at the implosion point, the trapezium cube of Orion being the biggest stargate in the galaxy, the subject of the Orion Wars. So that's the beginning of understanding something about what it takes to steer in that array. How do you see into the future faster than light to steer if you're going faster than light? Does that sound like it might be a little tricky? Well, it starts with really good lucid dreaming. Remember, when you feed golden ratio infrasound to binaural beats in your headphones, and you feel at first like you're imploding out of your body, it's literally the raising of the Jed. Well, what's happening is the superluminal components are beginning to cascade and line up and enable you to steer. Now, once you begin to be able to look down that tube, remember, here's the kids, they just got golden ratio brainwaves, and their eyes are closed, and they say a little vortex tube appeared inside, and I could look through it like an eyeball. And then the next thing they know, they not only can they see without eyes, but they begin to see ancestors. Well, they're beginning to have the skill to navigate in a dream. You know how in 9 Faces of Christ, first he could see his lover, but he couldn't smell her in the first dream. And then the second dream, he took more organs of perception along. So the more you become coherent in the dreaming, the more you be able to steer. You know how when the rabbi of Prague made a golem, he visualized in sequence a sequence of plasma donuts using the symmetry of the tetra, and those plasma shadows are called Hebrew. And if you visualize them in sequence correctly, the plasma donuts can nest and be woven together into an array, in this case called a golem. Now, the ability to, how come that golem didn't have a soul? Well, it wasn't actually lucid dreaming. It didn't have Enki's recipe, but they were able to make living plasma. So what enabled that plasma ultimately to implode and have a soul, the metaphor is popping the quiff. It is that somebody has to turn it inside out. It's like Jesus picks up a clay bird and suddenly that clay bird is flying away. This is more than metaphor for Enki saying, oh, well, you know, this gene pool here has potential, Adam Kadmon. All we need to do is teach them how to have a soul. And all that means is your kids are going to have to learn how to lucid dream. This could be called the Guild Navigators. So how we get on this subject was about the time navigator of Montauk, Michael Ash, who was to steer the time chair. And this was a skill specifically the Draco, Charlie was his name, who ran Montauk, did not have. And why did he need humans? Oh, humans had something the Draco need? Isn't that refreshing? A soul. Oh, what's that? Oh, maybe we should study the physics. And then they called it Boson 7. So the climax comment on the Michael Ash meeting is why they called the navigator the time empath. Empath means someone who, like Nostradamus, saw the future so well, in part because he was regularly weeping for those whom he saw. That's a time empath. So yes, he had learned how to make the right coating on the bottom of his water scrying cup, which is a phase conjugate mirror. And yeah, you know, this is all true, phase conjugate mirrors. But the real skill to be the empath, and who is the best Therify operator? The empath. Why? Who is the best tornado steerer? The empath. Who can steer? And why is steering tornadoes identical with being the navigator? So this is a lesson I would like to recall from my relationship with the Montauk boys. Anywho, well, just going down my list, the other people on the list was when I knew Bruce De Palma through Tom Vallone and the Faraday Disc Principle. And Gene Ringe introduced me after we were with Vogel to Gopi Krishna, whose a book on Kundalini I somewhat laughed at, unfortunately, because Gopi Krishna is saying, oh, Kundalini's killing me and Kundalini is so painful and oh my, oh my, oh my. It was like a crybaby. Well, actually, not knowing enough about the physics of Kundalini, yes, it can feel like a pain, but if you understand plasma density and what it takes to support more lightning in the aura. So that my first encounter with literature on Kundalini, and even, who was that? Oh, Krishnamurti. He was adopted by Blavatsky, and he was going to be the next avatar. But he was desperately afraid of his own Kundalini, really, because he didn't understand that level of plasma density and what it likes, what it means to inhabit a lightning bolt. These people really didn't understand the science. And I had the privilege of knowing, well, at least Gopi Krishna through Gene Ringe. But this led me to believe later I was doing meditation at Gene Ringe's Human Dimensions on the hill overlooking Canandaigua. And the meditations were incredibly powerful. And then at the Gurdjieff School, I started having intense Kundalini experiences. But I had been studying the biophysics of intense emotion. And then I was adopted by Bentov, who wrote the book on Kundalini. So I didn't get sucked into the personality worship or the, poor me phenomena. It was a matter of having the discipline to handle that level of amperage through the body. And I won't say, I don't say I've conquered it. No, but I understand enough of the biophysics to at least work on the hygiene it takes to handle that kind of charge density inside the body. And after Daniel Brinkley learned to survive lightning bolts, he wrote very good books about near-death experience, didn't he? So the other person that Gene introduced me to was Carlos Suarez, who later, in his work on Hebraic, well, at that time, I had just read Hebraic Tongue Restored by Fabre d'Olivet and realized you could retranslate Genesis based on the shape of the letters alone. Sefer Bereshith, that first in principle origin of thing nest, turning inside out nest. But then later, Fred Wolf adopts Carlos Suarez and does the spectrograms of the Hebrew alphabet. And when I was traveling with Tom Vallone, we had just left De Palma's house and we visited Fred Wolf, who invited us in for wine, actually. And Fred Wolf had spent many years or some good quality time with Carlos Suarez replicating his spectrograms of the Hebrew alphabet, which is if you pronounce Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet correctly, the frequency signature, phonon shadow, literally the geometry of the pressure plicative, is the shape of the letter itself. Aleph, Aleph. I made a sphere and put a stem on my olive, Beit, a container, Beit Gimel. So I then replicated that work from Carlos Suarez in my first book, Alphabet of the Heart, actually. And I was privileged at that time. A lady from Jerusalem, Carol Lee Aber, was living with me at my farm in Western New York, Crystal Hill Farm. And she knew how to pronounce the Hebrew letters, as she said, like they do in Jerusalem when they're signing off at midnight radio, like old time pronunciations of the Hebrew letters. And they were Aleph, Beit, Gimel. Very, very powerful, deep pronunciations. And if you did a spectrum analysis of those letters, you got the pictures of the letters directly. So the phonon geometry is the optical. This is literally, the computer can talk because all it does is put the shape of the letters through a Fourier transform, and the sound of the letters is the shape of the letter. Hello, if that ever was the physics of psychokinesis. So this was then what led me then later to take the spiral on the torus and plot the optical origins of the letters as well, which we now know is literally a genetic engineering language, which also was Draco. Actually, that's why Enlil, and it was a Jewish alphabet. What does that mean? Ibi Uru, when the Uru the serpent feeds the ebi. Then the Hebrews say that means crossing over. Well, what was crossing over? The bird brain was crossing over to the reptilian brain stem. And this was a necessary implication of the connection between Enlil, whose mother was reptilian, and Enki, whose mother was Syrian. When the serpent feeds the eagle, Quetzalcoatl returns. And guess who Quetzalcoatl was? Okay, so I'm going to stop here soon. I'm just see if there's, so we talked about Bearden a bit. We talked about Preston Nichols. We didn't talk about Noam Chomsky. I had fun with Noam Chomsky in his office at MIT. He just was not ready to hear the physics of the origin of alphabet letter forms. No. Like, he says, oh, languages have specific rules in common, but can you actually derive alphabet letters from the pure physics of toroid symmetry? Was he ready to hear that? Hell no. But it was fun. I could tell you the story of my astrologer who I met with just before. Oh, and then I should tell you more about traveling with Elizabeth Rauscher. Elizabeth Rauscher and I met at Stanford Research Institute, I think it was. No, it was Lawrence Livermore Lab first. And she's down in the basement where they're running the atom smasher. She says, oh, I like it in here because the sound of the atom smasher is so meditative. But Elizabeth Rauscher was running the fundamental physics group at the time. And later then, after the Physics of Consciousness Symposium at Harvard, she traveled with me down the coast, actually. And we stayed at Bentov's together. We visited the biophysicist who was Bentov's biophysicist, Earl Etienne. It was very famous, and that's another story. And then we went to Muktananda's ashram and witnessed them drinking the bath water. And actually, that was Frida Morris, who wrote the book on self-hypnosis, who at that time was partnered with Lisa Nella, who wrote the book Psychosis or Transcendence about Kundalini. So I had many adventures with those people. Eventually, we brought Elizabeth Rauscher to Europe 2 or 3 times for international conferences here. And she later credited me with inventing the idea of phase conjugate magnetics, because I invented the frequency signature, which she later proved is the frequency signature of the magnetic fields, which she documented were pain reducing. Now we know that phase conjugate magnetics is implosion magnetics, and we have devices which we're about to launch. It's called piezo fire, guys. It's amazing. And all you do is take the super piezo pair, and you use the same phase conjugate pump wave, and then you take a super dielectric, in this case shungite, and you have a broad spectral implosion between these little transducers. And man, can you attack pain and circulation problems. It's amazing. It's all about implosion, and phase conjugate magnetics is just the beginning. So as you can see, I had a certain amount of fun, and my voice is starting to wear out. And did I forget any major representations on my chart here? Oh, well, I probably skipped a few. I want to acknowledge my friend Dave, who is working with Hal and others. I want to acknowledge Duncan Rhodes for his work with, I want to acknowledge Jay Widener. We just had a wonderful interview together. I want to acknowledge Drunvalo and Ron Holt for sponsoring my first dozen or more world tours. At that time, remember, Yurka, Gaia TV, was the only checkbook behind all the fun people. And so, and the day I lectured the International Flower of Life facilitators in Cave Creek, I received invitations to speak in like 15 countries and went around the world every year for 10, 15 years. And so I was privileged, and my way of being grateful for that privilege is right here in front of you today, freely sharing as much as I can about, how I have been gifted. So many times, like in Toronto, my inner voice would say, okay, I was having dinner with Marcel Vogel and said, get up, go down the road. And I just went down, and there was Chris Bird leaving to meet Henry Evering, Psychotronics. And sequences of miraculous meetings, dozens right in a row. Obviously, the universe wanted me to receive an education. And for that, I am absolutely grateful. I received the best education on the planet from, I had, 5 or 10 international best engineering universities on the planet offering me scholarships after high school, and I was adopted by the Jesuits in a monastery garden in the engineering school. So the universe gave me a good education. And for that, I have to be super grateful. And my way of being grateful is to make that freely shareable. And that will then apply also to my new book, plancfire.com. The teaser is there. And Tufan helped me to put that together beautifully. And that will be out soon. It'll be available in 4 ways. It'll be available on Kindle, on PDF, in print, and as HTML. This is going to be a shareable wave, Shelley. And so I'm just here thankful. This was not intended as a name dropping. This was not intended as a criticism of all these wonderful geniuses on whose shoulder I stand. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that it is our obligation to complete what these people started. When everybody says they're jealous because we didn't get global wireless power from Tesla, but in fact, Tesla missed at least 2 of the very key principles of longitudinal interferometry that enable global wireless power. So instead of complaining that we didn't get the gift of free energy, let's understand what free energy it is. It is charge distribution efficiency, which requires fractality. Okay, that was my little happily ever after. Tufan, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Dan. We have 7 or 8 questions, and what we can do is I have noted all the questions, and I don't want to tire you more. Maybe we can just answer the questions later and share them on our social media channels. What do you think?
I just had another little drink of tea, and this is so much fun. I could do a few here.
All right, then let's go. Okay. So Michelle is asking, is there a way to check the planes of a Vogel crystal to see if they line up correctly?
Yeah, thank you for asking the right question. So the physics of how the molecular plane is regularly aligned with the facet plane is that the z-axis of the quartz, I brought my slinky down. Where did I put it? Oh, yes. So that the long z-axis of quartz, remember, quartz is hexagonal because the top-down view of a cube is hex, and the SiO2 bond is a tetracube, and that is rotated up that helix, helically, like a slinky up the stairway, as it were. Now, that z-axis of that quartz crystal is handed as in an enantiomorphic, the stairway goes one way only. And the way of measuring the z-axis accurately has to do with the fact that the plane of polarized light will be optimally rotated when it's perfectly parallel to the helix of that z-axis, which, for example, is the critical ingredient for what made the Rife microscope work. Hello, you got to get that right, man. See, what Rife did was he took the birefringent, which is the fact that not only does the polarized light rotate a particular predictable number of angular rotations up that helix, but if the polarized light is perfectly parallel or lined up with that helix, then the number of rotations of the plane of polarity will be accurate, thus enabling you to locate the perpendicular facet planes accurately. You have to pass coherent light, polarized light, up the z-axis to determine accurately where the z-axis is. It's like the zipper of DNA making a soul up the hydrogen imploder at the center of the ladder rung bonds. Anywho, so the coherent polarized light will traverse that polarity, the rotating plane of polarity accurately if the facet planes are accurately aligned. Now, further to say that the reason the Rife microscope disobeyed the law of physics that says you can't see anything smaller than the wavelength you're looking at it with, Rife disobeyed the law, was he used the birefringence, the fact that the polarized light will be split into 2 parallel planes of polarity rotating up. Now, if you take one plane of polarized light and reflect it out of the crystal and bump it through a virus and then back into the crystal, and then you rotate the planes of polarized light back into each other, you'll have something that approximates Nemarsky interference or phase contrast microscopy, and the shadow between the reference plane and the interference plane of polarized light using that z-axis accurately will enable you to see something very small. And you can actually look in vivo. So Rife was a genius, and he discovered which frequencies would blow up the viruses. And he tripped over my equation indirectly. So anyway, The z-axis of the quartz crystal is the trick to identify accurately the angle of the facet planes. And then you can implode those and make a fire crystal. Next question.
Next one, let's see, from Tomislav. Does Dan find any use in Ra-Uruhu's human design at all?
What's the name? Human?
Ra-Uruhu.
Oh, yeah. You know, I looked at some of that human design stuff, and I don't think I studied it enough to make a comment. I apologize, but I don't think I could comment usefully. So I'm going to pass on that question. Sorry. I'm interested. I will check it out.
Thank you. Mara asks, is longitudinal wave collapse because of phase switching in liquid crystals? What does dielectric mean?
Phase switching in liquid crystal is not necessarily a longitudinal phenomena. Phase switching would mean, for example, an ambient frequency field would toggle between various stability states based on whether the wavelength of the field effect entrains the wavelength of the molecular array. And phase switching is a beautiful, interesting subject between ice and ice 9, for example. And most of that would not be directly related to longitudinal coherence phenomena. But what's the second part of that question?
The second part of that question is, let me see.
It was two parts.
What does dielectric mean?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry, I should have remembered. Getting late. The dielectric is a very important and very simple concept. Dielectric constant is a measure of the efficiency of charge distribution in what's between the plates of a capacitor. Very simple. In other words, if you want to measure the dielectric constant of anything, you put it between the plates of a capacitor, something like steel, metal, and you have a specified thickness, and then you measure the amount of capacitance in farads, or microfarads, or nanofarads, and then you divide that by a simple equation to determine how efficient the dielectric was. In other words, how able that was to create an echo in the capacitance ringing between the two plates of conductive material. Now, why is that profound? Because living material generally is high dielectric, meaning the charge is distributed efficiently, meaning that capacitor could be a ringing bell. And you know how, let me just give you in very simple terms. If I make a simple capacitor, two metal and a little wafer, a partial insulator between which is dielectric material, and that dielectric material has a dielectric constant, I don't know, something over 20,000. If the dielectric constant is high enough, that capacitor is a source of zero-point energy by definition. So that's why all living materials have high dielectric, because they enable charge distribution efficiency, and charge distribution efficiency is life. Hello. That's why if you live in an aluminum box, your aura is toast. Whereas if you live inside of living material, your aura can unpack and your kids can grow up. The dielectric constant is a very important subject. Bioarchitects.net.
Next one from Ajda. What is your humble prediction about what's going to happen in connection to these giants? I am Slovene. I have heard JP spoke about Slovene King Matthias that sleeps under Peka mountain. That is part of our old legend. That say one day he will wake up and save humans from suffering and injustice.
You know, the Mexicans have a legend about Thoth. Quetzalcoatl is returning, and his birthday seems pretty close to mine. And when I grew up in Zoar Valley, Western New York, there was a legend about 9-foot-tall, red-haired skeletons. And then when I went to Wollumbin, Mount Warning in Australia, and this is a nod to Jenny, there was the female queens of the ancient shamanic aboriginals on Wollumbin, Mount Warning, said, our secret is there's 9-foot-tall skeletons of red hair down under here. And then JP says, a 9-foot-tall skeleton of Thoth Hermes is under Florida. So what is this recurrent legend of these big skeletons? Well, part of that, it's not the whole legend, but a good part of that legend is, I think Elena Danaan did have that right, that Thoth, that Enki Ea had a team, you might think of them as science officers, for which Thoth, Hermes, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha are more than metaphor for that team. And so they were very tall, ancient wisdom beings, and their task was to implement Enki's assignment here, which was basically self-chosen, which was that we could be the vaccine for the Orion Wars. We could be the secret recipe to ensoul humans at a higher level. Because remember, Enki was shocked when he saw the power of iron-mediated hemoglobin. He had only seen green blood up to that point, like Jean-Charles' blood was green and Enki's blood was green. And this is chlorophyll and hemoglobin have only one atom of difference. I think it's magnesium. So when he saw the power of iron blood, he called it Adam, the red man. And he knew that that iron at the center of our blood could have more leverage on steering the lightning than he'd ever seen before. And we could be the vaccine for the Orion Wars, which is why I was so proud recently when Elena said that the tall grays that hoodwinked Eisenhower and Truman, they caught here and they used them to plant a virus. And that was the vaccine for the Orion Wars. And the navel got wiped out of all the queens of Orion. It was so cool. We were the vaccine. I think it's fabulous. Anyway, that's my little story about the 9-foot skeletons.
Earthen Hand asks, have we done any measurements yet of bliss states associated with ayahuasca ceremonies?
Hi, Scott. Welcome, Scott. Nice to see you, Earthen Hand. Scott, we had some fun here with Scott. Thank you. Glad you're here. So, an Earthen Hand is part of our bioarchitects.net team as well. But in terms of ayahuasca, what I can say is we know that some of the people who use ayahuasca, I knew my friend who was a shaman in Sedona, ran the Santo Daime ayahuasca church there. And he was more able to see plasma entities, but was more afraid of plasma entities in part as well. And I think, in fact, that their aura did become more porous, actually. So I think ayahuasca use, regular ayahuasca use, does have a hazard of creating a more porous aura. That's my subjective observation. But at the same time, the Iboga work, which is also profound for addiction remission. Remember, people who have addiction problems, if they find a legitimate way to have a bliss experience, then the addiction is gone. Ain't it cool? We have a bunch of films about that. So a legitimate peak experience can replace in fact, that's also the principle of ancient art of resurrection. A really good near-death experience, and you have no problem with addiction. Ain't that cool? All you got to do is die. Oops. But the Templars understood that, actually. See, because if you can get through the still point, you can get through anything. You got perspective. My father had a near-death experience. So what I can say is Iboga schools, which are very effective for addiction, have used Therify plasma peak experience very effectively in synergy with Iboga, actually. So there's a beautiful science of addiction. Addiction is basically a wrong turn on the right road. People know they need a peak experience, and the addiction is, I need a peak experience. Well, you just show them what is a good peak experience. They don't need the bad one.
Jopi asks, when the top of the head burns, does it mean unable to compress?
As someone who has felt the top of my head burn like a firecracker for the better part of 30 years, I can tell you, it radically accelerates blood sugar consumption. It means you can talk fast. It creates a communication device. It does. It's like having a candle on the top of your head. And it's also like having a red hot coal on the top of your head that you can't knock out. But it's a communicator, so it's gorgeous. But the problem is, if you're not good at turning that off, it means you really shouldn't be standing under mercury vapor lights much because it's really going to toast your aura. But no, the flame on the top of the head from Pentecost, if you know your Catholic myth, the Pent is actually a name for the total number of facets in the Star Mother. Hello, it is. It's 50 faces. And the reason it's called Penta is because the flames have completed their symmetry operations for total implosion. And if the people are present in the Penta in that symmetry, there is a communion of saints. And that is a beautiful thing. So the potential is fabulous and the risk is high. But what else is fun?
Okay, 8 more to go.
Well, maybe another like 5 minutes and my voice is going to die here.
Dan Mac asks, what about the Birkeland currents of plasma from the sun? Are these the currents getting blocked by the moon?
That's a pretty complicated question. I don't even know if I'm expert enough to ask. The Birkeland current is a profound indicator of the Earth's communion with the sun for sure, and have all kinds of psychological implications. And I'm sure the moon can get in the way occasionally, but that's not the general principle of Birkeland currents. Birkeland currents is a maybe inductive reactance response to the plasma filaments of the sun and a profound study of the Earth-sun relationship. I don't think I'm even competent enough to say much more, other than one more thing. I think Gurdjieff said correctly that planets and stars experience gravity relations erotically. I think that's something to meditate on.
Thank you. Next one. Isn't awareness and walking of various timelines a classic talent of a shaman? Melissa asks.
Walking various timelines. That's a pretty heavy question, but what Aboriginals called songline dreaming track could also be called a timeline. But I remind that even the Templars, my friend William Buehler, who was perhaps the best Templar wizard of our day, goldenmean.info/Buehler, Buehler, he was clear that it took them decades perhaps to work with clearing the pollution in the timelines caused by things like Montauk, because fractionating timelines are very damaging to genetic memory, actually. So it is true that timelines can split. And remember, in the SSP experiencers, they use trauma to split timeline memories, and that ain't good, because timeline memories need to hang together as an implosive fractal for evolution to be negentropic. And so when timelines are split up, this is fractionating to genetic memory in general. So they called this the repair of the fabric of time in the Templar agenda. You can read articles at goldenmean.info/Buehler about this. Yes, it is possible to walk multiple timelines, but I warn that, for example, we believe that one of the ways in which Gosha's Swaru lost her soul and was reconstituted from ship's computer memory was too much time travel, actually, and that there is a serious danger of fractionating the soul when these portals are used too much and without enough coherence, and that really the true masters avoid fractionating timelines and know how to repair the fabric of time, which is essentially, remember, time is a name for relative spin rate, and spin rates couple across time, and that is the only physics of coincidence. It's literally capacitive coupling. For example, when the Princeton Noosphere project measured that the collective conscious was affected on 9/11, well, that's actually capacitive coupling to a longitudinal array, and that was a fractionating of timelines, actually. And to reassemble that requires the same kind of healing that bliss enables. So very, very complicated question, but to keep your focus on the timeline that matters and to not fractionate timelines is to keep your focus, and that ability of will to hold a tornado to center is the beginning of all consciousness.
Okay, next one from Denmark. When do the piezo devices come out?
Piezofire.com, I think is going to be super effective. Patrick, who is the programmer here, we're using the software from Flame and Sound, etc., really wants to do some more testing. We have personal experience here. Numerous times, serious pain issues have been taken care of. It's amazing. But we want to get clear. We think the bifiller miniature Tesla coil one is more for tissue, and the piezo speaker with the shungite is more for bone. And we're doing experiments to see, which are, but these things are not that expensive. You could actually have access to both. So I'm envisioning in the next 2 to 3 months, with any luck, we will have piezofire.com available. These are going to be fun tools that can be used with our other devices. Thank you.
I think we are all looking forward to that. Saraswati asks Mr. Winters, any advice on how to correct the decipher communication coming through the symbols? Intuitively, I know the transmission is regarding children and the secret space station project. The symbols look like Enochian alphabet, but I know nothing more than a screenshot of what the alphabet looks like. Any advice, guidance is greatly cherished.
Well, that might be a lead-up question to next week when Teresa Burns is talking about Ophanim Enochian. I could mention here that when Vincent Bridges saw the Ophanim Enochian alphabet, and then he put it in a table, and then he realized that the geometry of that table was literally a hypercube. It was an unpacked cube in the 6 directions, 6 directions around 1. So pattern recognition plays a key role in understanding how a symbol creates a symmetry array. It's like, walking in flatland and not knowing a cube exists, and you saw a point, a triangle, a hex, a triangle, and a point. And you saw that a million times, and a cube had passed through flatland, but you lived in flatland, so the only thing you saw was a point, triangle, hex, triangle, point. But the same cube, a hex tipped down, had passed through a piece of paper called flatland, your world, a billion times. And on the billionth time that cube passed through flatland, you had done a rhythmic traverse and done digital sampling, and suddenly what popped into your head, even though you were living in flatland, what a cube looked like. You were in the next dimension. So that's called pattern recognition. And that is a clue toward discovering how symbolic arrays can point you toward the next dimension, quite literally. But maybe that should be continued next week.
Thank you. Can you explain how the halo metal moon might relate to the moon placement in a natal chart?
I'm not an astrology expert. I just did this film with this astrologer. My general impression here is that in the sense of the hollow metal moon, it functions as a useful limitation astrologically, and moon replacement probably has to do with the fact that the moon is basically where the charge is temporarily blinding you from communication with the longitudinal array, which is what the moon does for us. So I would say that awakening from something that has been hidden from you is symbolized by the moon and would have astrological implications. But I'm not competent to have astrology discussions.
Okay. Next one from Bob Sheen. How important is avoiding Bluetooth and Wi-Fi for astral hygiene? Are there alternatives?
Yeah. In my personal experience, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi are excruciatingly horrible and really bad news. I'm sorry, but we get nausea immediately when the Wi-Fi comes on here. We're super careful. Everybody has to turn their Bluetooth. Now, we use a little bit of Bluetooth for the Flame in Mind because we have to, but generally that's only a couple minutes. Bluetooth is a nasty square wave. It ain't good. It's really, so no, I'm saying that, if you want to experiment with bliss capabilities, take some care to unplug some transformers and turn off the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And there are obviously, Ethernet cables work great. You do not need Wi-Fi. I can tell you from personal experience, works even better. So turn the damn Wi-Fi off and get that Bluetooth off as much as possible. And do not use Bluetooth headphones. No. And yes, we had to use a little Bluetooth for the Flame in Mind, but only for a few minutes. Thank you very much. Okay.
We have 2 more to go.
Okay. I am sort of losing my throat. So briefly. Yeah, briefly.
All right, we are almost there. John Hare asks how to fix the aura after becoming porous. He's asking because probably it happened to him, he says.
You know, I had a long conversation with Gumati, my partner at that time, Pam, who's a meditation teacher. And I said, well, you know, most of the people who come to meditation schools, why do they come there? She says they're trying to recover from their holes in the aura from too much drug use. And so their short answer actually was long-term discipline in meditation, actually. But any form of yoga, sacred gymnastic, you know, tensegrity, all of these things, that build coherence in the aura. I mean, you need all of the above. You need exquisite diet, you need yoga, you need sacred gymnastic, you need biologic architecture, you need everything that's possible to re-implode the aura, because it will only repair those holes slowly, but it will repair for sure. It does work, but it requires effort. And this effort includes discipline around meditation, yoga, diet, thinking shareable thoughts, avoiding anger, avoiding stress. It's all of the above, because that's the only way your aura is going to resynthesize. But if you are able to relax in sacred space and live a healthy lifestyle, it's amazing what you can fix.
Knapper asks, could Therapy heal my mother's CCSVI, multiple sclerosis?
My sister had a form of MS. I don't really know. I can't say. I know that we have serious reports of helping people with forms of Alzheimer and dementia. We have multiple reports that, at least temporarily and even more than temporarily, we have been able to help such people. But the MS, I haven't researched enough to comment. I know that because profoundly Therapy appears anecdotally now useful for inflammation issues and circulation issues, that in itself is indicative it can probably be useful for things like MS. But commenting in detail, I can't say for sure. I would say we have enough anecdotal now to say that it's really worth a try for certain kinds of dementia and Alzheimer's. But for MS, I don't know yet. I know there are some anecdotal reports, but I don't want to claim anything other than to say, in cases like this, we suggest give it a try for a few weeks. You know, the reports are amazing.
Cheryl asks, this is the last question, does shungite help with Wi-Fi?
Shungite is a super dielectric, very useful to function as a concentrating lens for capacitance. An electric field can be lensed usefully through shungite, which is why shungite is super helpful for piezo speaker focusing implosion on a pane. It's very cool. I got to show you my new shungite spheres over here. They're fun. But what was the question was, does it help for electrosmog? Was that the question? Was it?
Yeah, Wi-Fi.
Oh, we've you know, shungite would be very conductive too, but whether that would break it up, you would need to have the shungite in an array that was centripetal. So it would take more than just shungite itself. If you had shungite along with some crystals, perhaps, in an array that looks a bit like a rose or a labyrinth and was implosive, then theoretically, yes. But the shungite by itself, I would suspect no. Okay, so I don't know if that was happily ever after. My voice is tired, but we had some fun, guys. Thank you for listening to my stories and my name dropping. I hope it was, you know, of service and helpful, and there's some pure principle in there somewhere.
Thank you, Dan. And Melissa says she's so sad that Fractal U is coming to a close, and she thanks you for all you shared, Dan.
Well, we're trying. We'll probably do some more. We're cooking. Lots of new ideas are cooking. So stay with us. Thank you so much, everybody. Bless
Bye,
you.
everyone.
I enjoyed your smiles. Thank you for your patience with me. Bye-bye.